Assassin's Creed 3 is a very divisive game. It's a game that somehow feels both overexposed and buried at the same time. Everybody has their opinion on it. But if you try to actually play the game for the first time, especially now, the one thing you'll notice is the remaster. That also terrible white glare, the melting faces, even the broken HDR on console. Before you even get to the title screen, it feels a bit off. Now yes, it is quite strange to start off this video about Assassin's Creed 3 by talking about the remaster being a downgrade to the original, but the big problem is that Ubisoft removed the original version entirely from storefronts. So if you don't already own the OG Assassin's Creed 3, or you're not digging around on key sites, your quote-unquote definitive way to experience this game is the remaster, and that's not exactly ideal, especially if you want a newcomer to enjoy this franchise. And I get it, remasters are meant to keep games alive on modern hardware, but with Assassin's Creed 3, the remaster is somehow the worst version of the game. The funny thing is that kind of sums up how people talk about this game in general. Assassin's Creed 3 has this very strange reputation from people that played it as the boring one, the slow one, the one with the dry protagonist. I don't want to sit here and say everybody else just doesn't get it, like I've suddenly unlocked some new revelation. Because when this game came out back in 2012, I was one of those people. Back at launch, coming straight from Ezio and his 3 excellent games, I thought Connor was just dull. He was a character that when taken at face value was very stern, and he seemed like a waste of time to invest emotionally in him. And once the credits rolled, I kind of filed Assassin's Creed 3 away as a very cool time period wrapped around a flat main character. And then I moved on like a lot of people did, and the Connor is boring idea just stuck into my head as a fact. A few years ago, I replayed Assassin's Creed 3 again, and that's when it started to annoy me just how wrong I'd been. Once you actually sit with Connor with a bit more life experience and without expecting him to be another Ezio, you start to see what Ubisoft was actually going for. Connor is somebody that comes across as very empty on the surface, but in truth he speaks like somebody who grew up in a different culture, in isolation, with trauma that never really leaves him. Now the problem is the game hides a lot of his best writing in places that most people never fully engage with, so the surface impression of him ends up winning. On top of that, replaying Assassin's Creed 3 really reminded me how strong the modern day was at this point in the franchise. In more recent Assassin's Creed games, or rather since Assassin's Creed 3, a lot of the time the modern day felt like a hindrance, a break that you just didn't feel was necessary. The thing is, the modern day in Assassin's Creed 3 never felt like a quick break between missions, it actually carried weight. And I know some people will hate hearing this, but Assassin's Creed as a whole has always been built around the modern day. Altair, Ezio, Connor, they're all pieces of a bigger story. The main character of this franchise has always been Desmond. The very first cutscene we ever see in the very first game is Desmond, Lucy and Vidic. So when Assassin's Creed 3 came out, it became the last moment where the modern day truly felt alive, where everything from Assassin's Creed 1 to Revelations finally came together, only to end in a decision that shut the door on the entire modern day storyline. Killing Desmond still feels like the moment Ubisoft made a decision they've been struggling to work around ever since, and we can clearly see that with what came after. So in this video, I want to finally talk about Assassin's Creed 3 properly, and talk about the game in a shining light, a game that I would class as a very misunderstood game, a game that deserves way more respect than the reputation it's stuck with right now. And to do so, we need to start at the very beginning with the prologue. The opening of Assassin's Creed 3 has a reputation at this point. Even people who have not played the game in years remember it as that really long Haytham intro. But how I see it is one of the smartest ideas that Ubisoft has ever made for the franchise, especially if you pay attention to the themes of the prologue that's being told. The game hands you this very, you could say, mature and, confident man in a coat with swagger, and it lets you get comfortable with him being the protagonist, not for one main mission, but for literal hours, long enough that your brain settles into the idea that this is the character that you're going to spend the rest of the game with. And that's the trick. The game opens in a way that almost feels like a trap. You're dropped into a London theatre with Haytham slipping through an audience, and before you can even figure out what the hell the game wants from you, Haytham pulls off an assassination in the middle of a full house. Now, not once does the game at that point imply who he assassinated and the importance of that character. We also don't know any context either. After the assassination, the entire building erupts into chaos, and Haytham walks out with this calm confidence that immediately sticks with you, and from there he links up with a group of men who clearly trust him, and they hand him a mission that sounds important enough to shape a whole game. He's told to set up operations in Boston and hunt down a key that's tied to an ancient ezio site. It feels big. It feels like the start of his story. Now at this point we can call everything that we do with Haytham as the prologue. We learn how he moves, how he approaches certain situations, how people respond to him. You watch him walk into rooms like he owns them. You see how easily he takes command of a situation, and how he never loses his composure. The game feeds you little moments that make him feel trustworthy, but it's not trustworthy in a moral way. It's trustworthy in the sense that this is the protagonist, and you must assume he's right. In fact, he also feels likable in a way that's dangerous, but you don't think about that yet because he's your point of view, and that's the trick of this game's introduction. The whole prologue is a slow burn built to get you invested into a man that you are not supposed to be rooting for. Not once in this prologue did it seem like the game was toying with the idea that this was the wrong man to be cheering on. It plays everything straight. The missions treat Haytham with the tone that you would expect from an assassin main character. The camera gives him the same heroic framing we've had in the past game with Ezio. He's somehow capable of leaping off tall buildings into a haystack, using a hidden blade and free running with ease, which I'd only assume is due to his father Edward Kenway training him in the ways of the assassin as a child, teaching him swordplay and other fundamentals around age 6. Haytham even gets his own supporting cast of characters. I guess you could say his own little squad of personalities that feel like they're being set up for a long story. You meet these people and the game asks you to take them at face value, and they feel like characters that you'll be seeing for dozens of hours. Now at that point you would assume he's our assassin to be attached to, so when that big reveal happens and it's shown that Haytham and his merry men are in fact Templars, it essentially feels like a punch in the face. You spent all this time following Haytham because the game trained you to trust him, and suddenly you're told he's been standing on the opposite side of the conflict the entire time. Mind you, at this point in the franchise, we are 5 games in, and we have not seen anything like this at all. Assassin's Creed Rogue was not released at this point. The game's prologue had you feeling like instead of easing into the Templar perspective, you are instead crashing into it after already forming a bond. It forces you to look back at every conversation you had, every mission you completed, and rethink what it all meant. As I just said, the franchise has never done anything like that at that point. This was Ubisoft flipping the whole idea of good and bad in Assassin's Creed upside down. Now the brilliance of that choice becomes even clearer when we meet Connor, who now we know is the main protagonist instead of Haytham. Usually when a new protagonist appears in a game like this, you get to learn the world alongside them. I mean, we learn about, Florence and Venice with Ezio, the Holy Land with Altair, but Assassin's Creed 3 does not give you that clean start at all. In fact, you already know the names of the men who will stand against him. We see it when we first get introduced to Connor, and how we stumble into a familiar face, Charles Lee. Suddenly, Charles Lee is not this guy anymore.
Master Kenway.
Yes, may I help you?
Charles Lee, sir. A pleasure to make your acquaintance. I've been asked to introduce you to the city, help you settle it. Oh, no need, sir. I've arranged for your bags to be delivered to the inn.
He's not the man who was once sucking off Haytham for the entire prologue and seemed like a harmless lapdog. Now he seems like the polar opposite.
I could snap your neck, you know. A little more pressure, and pop. The sad little flame of your life extinguished.
He grabs Connor and demands the location of his village. Connor spits in his face and swears he will remember him, but Charles Lee knocks him out. And when Connor wakes up, he finds everything burning. His mother is trapped under fallen beams and he cannot pull her free. Now that moment becomes the root of everything that comes after. Now here's what I want you to do. Imagine that Connor and Charles Lee scene happening before the prologue with Haytham. It just wouldn't work as well, as it would feel less impactful. And that's why the prologue matters so much. Somebody like Charles Lee is not a stranger when he steps back into the story. We've already watched the way he moved around Haytham, the way he sat in those rooms and played along. So when Connor enters the story, young and furious and still trying to figure out who he is, he walks into a world that already feels lived in, because you've been inside it long before he arrives. That's where the entire prologue becomes something more than a slow introduction. For me, I see it as the foundation for Connor's entire tragedy. You don't need exposition to understand how overwhelming Connor's path will be, because again, you've already spent hours watching the very people who will tear his life apart. And without saying a word, the game shows you exactly what Connor is up against. People love to say the prologue drags on for too long, and maybe it does, but the point of that prologue is the length. Think about it, if the prologue was finished after a couple of missions, that twist with Haytham being a Templar would feel so cheap and low effort. If Haytham walked in with a cheeky hint that he wasn't what he seemed, nobody would fall for it. The writers of Assassin's Creed 3 needed you to trust him for the story to land the way it does. It needed you to actually like him. And hey, it worked, because Haytham is still one of the fan favorites in the franchise, even though he's a Templar. I mean, can we say the same for the likes of the Borgias, Flavius, Starrick, Germain? No, we can't. Which means the plan landed exactly how they wanted. So in the end, the prologue is basically a trap. and we as a player walk straight into it without even thinking. But for everything the prologue does well, there are some real problems that stand out when you replay it today. And they're not small issues either. One of the biggest flaws in my opinion is how many characters a game throws at you in a very short window. Haytham meets a shit ton of characters one after the other, each with their own importance. And the game barely gives you time to latch onto them before it moves on. Instead of a slow, steady build, the game hits you with a lineup all at once. And unless you already know the franchise inside and out, it's easy to get overwhelmed. It also doesn't really help that Assassin's Creed as a franchise leans so heavily into historical authenticity. That's part of its identity, right? And Assassin's Creed 3 takes that to an extreme. This game wants you to recognize real historical figures, as in to remember their roles in the revolution and track how they intersect with the Templar Order. But when the prologue stacks fictional Templars on top of real historical characters, the whole thing starts to blur together. The writers assume that you already know these people, or at least have context for them, yet most of us don't. You're asked to invest in characters tied to the actual American history, but you barely see them long enough to understand why they matter in the narrative. I mean, take Benjamin Franklin for example, that's a knockoff Leonardo da Vinci. So while the game's prologue is, and I think it's quite bold and very important for the actual story of Assassin's Creed 3, it's also extremely overloaded. And that's why so many people walk away from it confused, or even impatient for the real game to start with Connor. And speaking of Connor, let's talk about him. Connor is a character that I feel like most people would call boring. If you ask somebody who you know is a casual fan of Assassin's Creed, they would describe him as the stone-faced one, or the man that just shouts, "Give me Lee!" and scowls his way through the American Revolution. And I do get why that stuck with a lot of people. As I said earlier, I used to think that way back when I first played this game. You go from 3 full games with this, charismatic Italian rock star to a quiet mohawk kid who takes everything seriously. Now, you could say that's a huge downgrade, and maybe it is in terms of personal preference. But how I see Connor in this game is one of the most human characters in the franchise. I would even say one of the most human characters in a game, and it's all because of what the story does to him. You see, he's just trapped in a game that keeps pushing him to the edge of his own story. The writers intended for Connor to not be written as a cool assassin fantasy type of character, in the same way, Ezio, Arno, or even Edward are. He's written as somebody who grew up between cultures and unfortunately fell victim to trauma very early, and then he was shoved into politics he doesn't understand much at all. For example, take his village. We see his village burn, right? We see his mother die right in front of him. The people responsible for that walk away untouched, and every system around Connor is built around the same type of men who caused it. Now, on top of that, you've got his background. I mean, take a look at the culture of Connor. He's raised in an environment where restraint and silence matters a lot. Now, that kind of personality doesn't translate well to an audience that expects a protagonist to joke and, be all humorous all the time. So when you'd often hear the Connor has no personality audience say that, a lot of the time what they really mean is Connor doesn't perform his personality in a way that I'm used to. He's a character that's idealistic in a way that hurts him. Throughout the story of Assassin's Creed 3, we see Connor take everything people say at face value for too long because he wants to believe that if somebody talks to him about freedom and justice, maybe they actually mean it when they don't. Now, as sad as it is, I'd say that mix of anger and optimism is why he spends the entire game running headfirst into disappointment. He keeps thinking if he fights hard enough, somebody somewhere will finally choose what's right over what's convenient, and the story of Assassin's Creed 3 punishes him for that every single time. Another big reason Connor gets misread is the way the main story of Assassin's Creed 3 is structured. You can clearly see that Ubisoft wanted to flex the American Revolution setting. I mean, it is Assassin's Creed after all, right? They wanted you to ride with these famous names in history and, stand at the big, real historical events that actually happened. I mean, you even hear the speeches that you saw in the school books. So Connor keeps getting dragged into what I would like to call history moments, where the game is simply more interested in the founding fathers than in him. And because of that, the game treats the American Revolution with more priority than Connor's own personal story. I mean, think about it. When we're watching a cutscene with these important real historical figures in the game, what's Connor doing? He's always 10 steps away from them, making sure the line that they are remembered for actually happens, and then Connor simply fades into irrelevance. And I believe that creates a weird disconnect. Connor should be the emotional core of the entire game, but he often feels like a very lethal extra in somebody else's movie. He fights at their side, he saves them from dying for God's sake and helps their cause, and then he watches them turn around and betray everything he thought they stood for. I'd say the clearest example is Washington. You see, Connor spends a good chunk of the game protecting him, and then he finds out he's responsible for the attack that destroyed his home. Connor doesn't get to rewrite that, or topple Washington, or even change the course of the war. History stays the same, and Connor walks away with the knowledge that the man that everyone calls a hero is the same man who ruined his life. That's the part a lot of Assassin's Creed fans bounced off. We're used to Assassin's Creed protagonists who feel like they're steering events. Altair reshapes the Brotherhood for centuries. Ezio rebuilds it. Edward changes his entire life and ends up founding something new. Bayek is the literal founder of the entire Brotherhood. And then there's Connor. What's Connor's special moment? What does he do? He spends most of his story finding out how little power he actually has. The Templars use him. The Patriots use him. Even Juno and the First Civilization, for God's sake, they use him. He achieves his immediate goals, yet he still loses everything he was trying to protect. That's just a tragedy. And that's exactly why the Homestead matters so much. If you only follow the main story of Assassin's Creed 3, you mostly see Connor at a very closed off level. But when you go back to Achilles' land and actually invest in those side missions, you suddenly meet a completely different side of Connor. The Homestead is where I guess you could say Connor's mask drops. There, Connor is so much more than a blunt instrument, as now he's a man helping out a community. He builds a couple of homes. He stops petty fights from breaking out. He listens to people's worries and tries to give them a better life than the one that he had. It's strange because we now see him with a smile on his face, and he even jokes a little. The community that he builds around the Homestead ends up feeling more like his real family than anything tied to the revolution. Now, what's smart about that is how it mirrors what he wants on a bigger scale. You see, in the cities and on the battlefield, Connor keeps fighting for this big idea of freedom, but it always gets twisted. At the Homestead, he finally gets to live out something closer to his own version of that. A place where different people can exist together. Where apart from being the outsider, his actions actually build something that stays. But you see, the problem is a lot of people skipped that content or treated it like filler. And I blame Ubisoft for that because they did an absolutely terrible job at telling you, hey, by the way, the Homestead content is where you understand who this man actually is. And because of that, the majority of people end up judging Connor based mostly on the main story, and I don't blame them whatsoever. It even goes beyond the Homestead, because on top of that, Assassin's Creed 3 hides a lot of his inner life in loading screen monologues or optional dialogue, and even a cut speech at the end that most people never saw in the game itself. Because Ubisoft just decided to cut something as great as his speech. Ubisoft clearly had a strong idea of who Connor was on paper, but I think they maybe fumbled a bit on the execution. So, to a lot of people, Connor looks like he doesn't grow, even though the man who blindly trusts the Patriots at the start is not that same person who quietly rejects them by the end. And that's why he's misunderstood. Not because there's nothing there, but because you have to look in the right places to find it. Aside from the historical story of Assassin's Creed 3, the modern day is just as important and needs to be talked about too. You see, modern day in Assassin's Creed is always going to split the opinions of the fanbase. Some people hear modern day and immediately roll their eyes, waiting for it to be over so they can get back into stabbing redcoats as Connor. And then there are people like me, who actually enjoyed it. I've said it before that I loved the modern day segments in the early games. They were the perfect thing. 15 minutes where you shake off all the Connor shenanigans and check in with Desmond's side of the story. Out of all the older games, I would say Brotherhood and Assassin's Creed 3 have my favourite modern day sections in the entire franchise, with Valhalla being in the third spot. I get why some people think the modern day is pointless. You pay to play an assassin in a historical setting, not run around as some crazy man in a hoodie stealing batteries for a space god. But Assassin's Creed 3's approach actually felt fresh. This wasn't something as stupid as walking around a warehouse reading emails. They finally let Desmond move. They let him use the skills that he observed through the Animus and act like an assassin in the present day. And two missions in particular still stick with me. The first one is the skyscraper mission. Desmond goes to New York, he climbs the One World Trade Center and parachutes onto another building to steal a power source. The view at the top still looks crazy even for a game from 2012. And that whole mission has this energy that the modern day never really had before. We also meet Daniel Cross there, which hurts a bit because if you know about Daniel Cross and his lore, especially in the comics, you would know how much potential that character had. In Assassin's Creed 3, he just gets dunked on by Desmond over and over. The second mission goes full MMA mode in Sao Paulo, and I swear I loved how weird it felt. You're so used to playing as an assassin in old historical cities, you know, riding horses. So seeing modern police officers and modern day characters inside an Assassin's Creed game at that time was so surreal. It's like your brain knew you're still in Assassin's Creed, but your eyes are confused as hell. Daniel Cross pops up again and gets folded by Desmond for the second time. You know, he really went from being a serious threat in the extended lore to being basically Desmond's bitch. And then there is the third power source mission, which is basically a rescue operation for William Miles. You break into Abstergo and fight your way through. You absolutely beat the shit out of Daniel Cross one more time to the point where you kill him. You kill Warren Vidic with the apple, and it ends with this small father-son moment that the franchise barely gave us. You know, I would say this moment would be the closest Desmond ever got to getting a win before the ending happens. And speaking of that ending, yeah, I'm not going to spend 10 minutes explaining the how, because we all know how Desmond dies. They straight up close the book on the main character who carried the franchise since day one. For some people, you may see it as a relief. But back then, I saw it as the biggest slap in the face, because no matter how you see it, that one decision to end Desmond's storyline changed the franchise forever, and in a negative way, because the end of Desmond meant the end of the original direction of Assassin's Creed. After this, Ubisoft did not have a bloody clue on what to do, or any type of clear modern day plan, and you can tell. Black Flag played it safe and turned the modern day into a little satire game about game studios in first person. The only positive from that was the Sage storyline with John, the IT technician. Unity and Syndicate basically gave up on the modern day, and ever since Assassin's Creed 3, it's been so split in terms of who wants the modern day and who doesn't. It did come back with Valhalla, but then after Valhalla, we know what happened. I for one absolutely adore the modern day, and I desperately want those big cinematic set piece style missions back again. But the problem is what Ubisoft are doing now, as they have chosen the middle of the road, and they have ended up with something that satisfies nobody. I mean, who actually gives a shit about the Animus Hub modern day, with the guide and the ego? I know I don't. But yeah, it's unfortunate what came after Assassin's Creed 3 with the modern day. Let's talk about the gameplay, because this is where I'm quite torn. First off, the combat. Now, you see, combat in this game is something that I always look back on with a sense of both good and bad. On one hand, I absolutely love how the finishers look. Connor moves with this, lightweight feeling that the franchise never really matched again. Every kill feels satisfying and, if anything, almost theatrical in a way. I mean, take the animations for example. You see, the animations change depending on what weapon you're using. So take the Tomahawk for example. The Tomahawk has its own brutality. The hidden blade feels a lot more clean, and then of course swords flow a bit more with grace. Even the moments that might not seem like a big deal, such as catching a musket mid-fight or switching weapons inside of a combination. This makes the whole system feel more engaging to play. Now, if Assassin's Creed 3 ever had a crown jewel, I would say the animation team carries the combat on its back. Now, for me, the part that doesn't age well is the structure sitting underneath all of that style. When you come back to it now, it's amazing how quickly everything falls into a very basic rhythm. The counter kill system has a window that is insanely huge, making it so forgiving. The enemies rarely pressure you, and once you understand the basic loop of the combat system, the game never really asks you to grow past it. I mean, you can literally walk into a fight, press maybe 1 or 2 buttons and watch the finisher happen. After that, you can let the chain carry you through that group of enemies. It feels cool, don't get me wrong. It gives you that badass feeling that you'd expect from a game called Assassin's Creed. But if we're talking about complexity wise or difficulty, there's not much going on. After a while, you start to notice how little the fights change from the start of the game to the end. That said, Assassin's Creed 3 has a few mechanics that I wish modern Assassin's Creed games would bring back. One of them would be to grab an enemy and use them as a human shield against rifles. There's also grabbing an enemy's weapon. That kind of stuff that gave the combat some nice flow to it. The franchise could absolutely use more of that style again, instead of relying on the same light and heavy attack routine we've had for years. And then we move on to movement. Now, movement in this game is a strange combination of freedom, a bit of jank, but also some limitation involved, and it's all wrapped into one system. Now, the first time you essentially move across a roof in this game or hop a fence, and then you launch yourself straight into a tree branch, it feels efficient in a way that the games before Assassin's Creed 3 never quite managed. But it's also one of the systems where Ubisoft had to evolve from what came before. But they did this at the cost of many different things. I mean, take city design. Boston and New York are most definitely not as efficient in its parkour layout in comparison to a Florence or a Venice. So what the developers had to do was find a workaround. But did it work? Yes and kind of no. But mostly yes. You see, the result that they created was a movement system that looks incredible in motion and sometimes feels incredible too, but it also had moments where you can tell it's wrestling with its own ideas. Ubisoft simplified the controls so much that your input became more of a suggestion than a command, instead of the setup that came in the games before, where one button handled running and another handled climbing. Everything was merged into one single input. Hold it down and Connor will sprint, vault, leap gaps, climb buildings or scramble up whatever's in front of him. Now, I get it in a way. The idea was to make his movement feel instinctive, almost like he's reacting to the world on his own, and when the system lines up properly, it really does look smooth enough to forget you're even controlling him. The problem is that this simplicity comes at a cost. Since the game is constantly trying to predict your intentions, there are plenty of moments where you're trying to sprint to a doorway or grab something off the ground, and Connor decides to jump onto a table or a barrel, or start climbing a wall that you had no interest in touching at all. In the Ezio trilogy, if you did not press the jump button, you stayed grounded, which gave you a level of control that offset the clunkiness that those games sometimes had. Assassin's Creed 3 removes that safety net. Once you commit to sprinting, you're basically handing the steering wheel to the game and hoping it understands what you meant. Now, where things get interesting is how this system fits the setting. Boston and New York are not dense old European cities. Their rooftops are not designed in a way that lets you stay up high forever. I mean, streets are a lot wider. Of course, not as wide as Syndicate, but still wide. The buildings sit far apart, and sometimes you're forced back to street level whether you want it or not. The parkour works better when the geometry is closer together, and since the cities in this game don't offer that kind of playground, a lot of the weight falls on the frontier. The forests basically become the real replacement for the Venice-style rooftops, and while it doesn't really fully replace the feeling of the older cities, it at least gives Assassin's Creed 3 its own identity. Connor being able to run through branches, swing across gaps and dive into snow fits him in a way that most protagonists never get from this setting. That said, you can see where the system holds you back. There isn't much room for personal expression in your movement. The older games let you use ejects, precise inputs and timing to squeeze out little bits of speed and style. Assassin's Creed 3 still has wall ejects, but they don't quite behave with the same freedom. I'm sure there's plenty of people that feel like the game was putting them on rails. And to be fair, sometimes it does feel like the animation system is doing the heavy lifting, while you just hold forward and watch Connor sort everything out. Even with its flaws, I cannot say I dislike Assassin's Creed 3's parkour. When it hits that sweet spot where building layouts and tree lines line up, the movement feels effortless. You see hints at what will later grow into Unity's approach. Assassin's Creed 3 might not have the depth of the games before, but it basically gave the franchise a new foundation to build on. Now, whether that's good or bad, that's up to you. And in the context of this world with this character, it still has a nice charm that's hard to shake. Now, stealth is something I feel negative towards in this game. It felt like the part of the game that got left on the cutting room floor halfway through. You can tell stealth is not the main focus of this game whatsoever. The flashy combat gets all the attention, the big set pieces get all the love, and stealth is kind of sitting there in the corner. When you actually try to get involved with Assassin's Creed 3's stealth system, you start to see the cracks pretty quickly. Now, at a first glance, the game gives you some solid tools. The rope dart alone is such a cool idea. Hanging guards from trees, yanking somebody into a bush, that feels great in a really fitting way for Connor. You've got stalking zones in tall grasses and bushes, little patches of foliage that let you blend in without needing a crowd, and they genuinely upgrade the old just hide in a haystack formula. Being able to sit in grass and whistle a guard over to then silently drop him is the kind of assassin fantasy that absolutely works. The game clearly tried to evolve the stealth kit from the Ezio era, just in a more grounded frontier style. The problem is everything around that toolkit. First off, there's no crouch at all. In a game that loves to toss you into fields and wide open areas, you still walk around like somebody out for a stroll. So instead of putting you along low cover, you're either fully exposed or glued inside a bush, hoping the AI decides it cannot see you. And the AI is all over the place. Sometimes guards ignore bodies practically at their feet. Other times they spot you from the other side of the place that they're at. And I don't think the mission design helps either, because Assassin's Creed 3 is full of optional objectives that demand perfect stealth in a game that barely supports it. When I made my video about the hardest missions to 100% sync in the entire franchise, a lot of the missions in that video were basically Assassin's Creed 3. Stuff like the infamous 2 ships mission in Charlestown turns into pure trial and error simply because of the inconsistent detection system. The setting also works against stealth more than people realize. This is the American Revolution, right? Redcoats firing muskets across open fields, cannon fire. The game constantly pushes you into loud spaces. Social stealth is basically a downgrade from the Ezio trilogy. You end up in this weird spot where the fantasy of being a hidden blade in the crowd just does not match the reality of what the missions are built for. Now, don't get me wrong, you can most definitely play Assassin's Creed 3 stealthy in moments, and when the systems align it feels decent. But as an overall package of a game, it clearly prefers you to snap and go into combat, and to be honest, with how flashy the combat system is in this game, most people eventually give up and lean into that instead. And there we have it, Assassin's Creed 3, a game that I do think is a very misunderstood game. It's a messy game, don't get me wrong, but it's the kind of messy game that I've grown to respect a lot more with time. For me, Assassin's Creed 3 ended up being the game that you think you know, but then you come back years later and realize you only ever saw the surface. So if you watching this have not touched Assassin's Creed 3 in a really long time, or if you bounced off it back in 2012, I would actually say give this game another shot, because maybe you'll see it in a different light. Now if you did enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.